Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. This week's episode is about tenure, the type of employment that those at universities can, and I stress can, hold. What is it? Why are some people opposed to it? And why do others, including my guest today, Deepa Das Acevedo, argue that it is in fact necessary to fight for and to preserve? I thought this was a really interesting conversation. It's quite a long one, and in the middle, we, without planning it necessarily, get into an extended conversation about public engagement in scholarship. So, like, to what extent is it good or desirable that academics should try and publicly talk about their work, for instance, on podcasts like this one? What are potentially some of the liabilities of that? And particularly, should that be a thing that academics are judged on when they apply for job positions or they apply for tenure? Stuff like that. I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. I don't have like hard answers on it myself, even as someone who kind of is on the other side of that equation, but I have questions and concerns. So, yeah, that is today's episode. I hope you find it interesting too. This is Tenure. I am joined today by Deepa Das Acevedo. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Toby.
Can I start with a really basic question? What is tenure?
That's a good place to start. Tenure is a form of employment contract that exists in the United States and Canada and in a couple of other places in the world, but has the most legal punch as a form of contractual relationship in the United States. So that's because of the baseline rule that applies to indefinite employment relationships in this country. Our default assumption when it comes to indefinite employment relationships in the United States is what we call the at-will rule, which means that either the employer or the employee, but what really matters is the employer's ability to do this, the employer can end the employment relationship for any reason, for a good reason, bad reason, or no reason at all, anything except an explicitly illegal reason. So that means that your employer could wake up one day and decide, it's Wednesday, I'm in a bad mood, you're fired. Or come into work and say, you're wearing purple, I hate purple, you're fired. Those aren't explicitly illegal reasons to fire somebody. And in the United States, most people who are classified as employees could be fired for those reasons with no notice, no severance payment, and they would have no legal claim. They would just be out of luck. And obviously, being out of a job is traumatic and difficult for most people. Tenure is one variety of a carve out or an exception to this baseline rule of at-will employment. The name for all of these types of carve outs is just cause employment, which means pretty much what it sounds like, that your employer, instead of being able to terminate you at will, needs to have just cause, some kind of reasonable grounds to end the employment relationship. There's a variety of ways in which just cause employment contracts can be structured, but tenure is one of them, and it's one of the more protective versions. In the US, specifically, what tenure tends to mean, there are institutional variations, obviously, but what tenure tends to mean is that after an initial period of probationary employment, when a new professor can be terminated at the end of a defined contract period, 1 year, 3 years, and so on, They're evaluated for eligibility to win tenure. And once they have received tenure, the nature of their contract with the university changes, and they can no longer be fired for any reason. They need to be fired only for a good reason. And the reason that tenure is particularly protective, even within the kind of universe of just cause contracts, is that tenure almost always means that the faculty member in question must be given notice of the justifications for their termination, must be given some kind of due process, and that process usually has to involve significant peer or faculty input or involvement. And it's only after all of that has happened, assuming that the cause for justification that's been provided by the university is upheld, that a tenured professor can be fired. So tenure creates a great deal of job security in a context where the default is that you do not have job security, even if you're an employee.
What does the process of getting tenure usually look like? Because you hear, as someone who's not in academia but is very adjacent to it, because I talk to a lot of academics, you hear a lot about tenure track as a sort of phrase that it's assumed everyone knows what it, but just assume that I don't know what it means. What is meant by tenure track, and like what would a typical, let's say, perhaps bracketing out the last year, but what would a typical process of gaining tenure in an American higher education institution look like?
So I think I'm going to limit my comments to American higher ed,
Yeah,
because there are
absolutely.
additional variations when we go broader. Within the US, I think that we can group faculty at universities and colleges into three very broad buckets. One is contingent or adjunct faculty who tend to be hired on a per course or per term basis. You've been hired to teach one particular subject for one term, whether that's a semester or a trimester and so on, or you've been hired to oversee one project if it's a research only position, but still called a faculty position. That's one category. The intermediate category is non-tenure track. This is often just abbreviated to NTT, faculty who have a longer relationship with the university that's hired them, but they're still not in that final bucket that I'm going to come to in a minute. So these people might be hired for a full year to teach multiple classes, or they might be hired for 3 years or 5 years. You can think of them as having definite durations of employment that are longer than whatever applies to people in the first bucket. The final bucket is what I'd call tenure stream employment. So this bucket includes individuals who are hired into tenure track positions, positions that allow them to apply for and potentially receive tenure at some point, and individuals who were hired into one of those positions and have successfully received tenure. Um, so if you have been hired into a tenure track position, one of that third most elite, most protective bucket type positions, then as a fresh entry level aspiring academic, you have probably gone on the job market, which increasingly means you are perpetually applying year round to any post that you become aware of. You submit personal statements, teaching and research statements describing your capabilities and your interests. You provide references and so on. You provide prior or forthcoming published work. Once you're hired as an assistant professor in most disciplines, that's the lowest rung of the tenure stream bucket. You usually have a 5 to 7 year period when you're considered a probationary tenure stream employee, so faculty member. So during that 5 to 7 year period, sometimes it's longer, varies by discipline. Uh, Most tenure track professors, who are also usually formally titled assistant professors, will be employed not on a continuous or indefinite basis, but they'll receive a series of defined duration contracts for 1 year or 3 years, usually. And that means that when each one of those contracts ends at the end of that time period, the university has to sort of affirmatively decide to offer you another one. And until you reach the end of your 5 to 7 or more year probationary period, you're trying to satisfy several markers, usually along teaching, research, and service axes that have been established by your unit within your institution in order to decide whether or not you deserve to receive tenure. You'll submit an application package that involves your own materials, reference letters, and so on. It goes through layers of evaluation at the unit level, possibly at the faculty or school level, then usually at the central university level. And assuming that you successfully pass through all of those levels of analysis, then you will be told that you've received tenure. And after that, you will no longer get those 1 or 3 or more year definite duration contracts. You'll receive no more contracts from your university because now you are employed on an indefinite basis according to a just cause employment contract.
How many people are in each bucket? So, like as a percentage or fraction or whatever, how many are in non-tenure stream of the two you referenced, working towards tenure versus have tenure? Of say, broadly everyone who might teach a course at an American university.
So it's very lopsided. Over the last 40 to 50 years, we have shifted from a majority of instructional faculty in the United States being in that third tenure stream bucket to a majority being in one of the first or second buckets, either very short-term adjunct faculty or non-tenure track longer term contract faculty. I think current estimates suggest that between I've heard everything from 70 to 80% of instructional faculty at American universities now are not tenure stream faculty. So only about 1 in 5 are eligible to win tenure or have received tenure and therefore are within the tenure stream.
What accounts for that shift? Because presumably professors, or sorry, teachers at universities have always, generally speaking, wanted that. And presumably, let's just be cynical and say most employers prefer their employees to be paid less and have less security. So why the change? Has there been a shift in the power balance from one side to another or an outside structural thing happening? Do you have any thoughts on why it's shifted so much?
I think we have to look to a variety of factors to explain why academic employment has shifted from being primarily in the form of stable, secure, long-term tenured employment relationships to being primarily in the form of insecure, contingent, short-term contracts. One is the defunding of public education, and this matters because so many of the institutions in the United States, ranging from small colleges to elite research one in universities, public. And so when fewer tax dollars come in, obviously administrators have less money to uh, use for faculty hiring. And it bears mentioning that in many disciplines, though not all, uh, labor costs are the single greatest line item in a unit or school or university's budget. I think another factor that we have to account for is that as uh, research has taken on more importance and become more worth pursuing for institutions in that prestige, Carnegie rankings, ability to recruit faculty and students, and with them their tuition dollars. As research has become more important to all of this, then there is a troubling pattern that has developed that generates an excess of supply in the number of people available to teach. What I mean by that is that uh, large universities, by and large universities generally run on the labor in the classroom of many people who are not tenure line professors. These may be graduate students who are teaching as they get their doctorates. These may also include contingent or long-term non-tenure track faculty. But as producing doctorates and doing research that involves training doctoral students has become more important for upwardly mobile institutions, then uh, you need to essentially bring in more graduate students in order to fuel that rise. That means, however, that you produce a lot more doctorates, which means there are a lot of people who entered an industry that does not have adequate demand for them once they're sufficiently credentialed to enter as full-time employees. And they're willing to accept poorer terms, adjunct contracts, non-tenure stream employment. That's also something that has accelerated over the last 30 to 40 to 50 years. Um,
That's
I
certainly my impression anecdotally interacting with a lot of academics, between people who are sort of coming up,
and I
baby
think
academics
that
versus more senior ones, is it's just brutal at the moment.
yes, it is brutal. I think I've it's very difficult to create estimates of the odds of getting an academic position, a stable tenure line academic position, but the folks who have tried to construct estimates say that if you successfully get your doctorate, which is the credential required in most but not all disciplines to have a full-time professor position, you stand anywhere from a 1 in 5 to a 1 in 10 uh, chance of actually getting that kind of position. Um,
I mean,
I
in my
think,
field,
mhm.
political, not my field, but the one I interact with most, like political theory, political philosophy, it seems to have happened to an almost comedic degree. Like you go back to like the 60s or 70s when Hannah Arendt and whoever was writing, they were just sort of talking like, oh, maybe we should do philosophy about politics. And you really did get this feeling it was sort of anyone who happened to wander into the room, was part of the field. And now, like people who are just like even like baby professors, like they've on their first book or whatever, have made it through an absolutely brutal series of selection processes. And on the one hand, I think the average quality of people who are coming up is better, but on the other, you have to wonder the human cost we've inflicted when just mathematically most people going in will have to find some other line of work at the end of it, for which doing all of that has not necessarily been a plus in terms of their earning power.
I think there's a real sense in which both academics and non-academics carry an image of what the college or university is and what it means to be the sort of flagship worker, the tenure line faculty in that environment that has not existed for a long time. And I think this image is as a professor, you get up in the morning, you teach a class or two, maybe. You meet a student or colleague for coffee. Maybe you walk over to the faculty senate meeting that's happening. You sit there for an hour, you pontificate a little bit, you come back home, read a little bit of a book jot down some ideas for your next book, and then you go to bed. And that this is what the life of an academic looks like. It hasn't looked like that in a long time because now higher ed institutions, particularly in the US, but certainly not limited to it, are vast, complex organizations that, particularly in the middle and upper levels, are better thought of as city states.
Do you want to cash that thought out a bit? I'm intrigued.
Sure. Um, uh, Standard, well-resourced R1 institution, like any of the universities I have either attended or have taught at, has a police force, has an internal healthcare system, has extensive IT infrastructure, building maintenance, entertainment provision, food delivery, housing, road. It's everything that requires uh, it's everything that is required to operate a small city state. Some of these institutions, like the University of Chicago, where I was for many years, or the University of Southern California, where my husband got his law degree, have police forces that are bigger than most small suburban cities in many parts of the United States. They have police forces of 100 or more officers. Um, I think that the complexity of institutional life in higher education and what that means for the working style, the everyday labor dynamics, as well as the labor burdens that are placed on faculty is deeply underappreciated. That's one part of why we don't quite capture how much things have changed in higher education. We just don't understand how much higher education, the institutional form that it takes, has itself changed. And naturally, what that means for the people who work in it uh, is also impactful. I want to go back for a second, though,
Sure.
to something that you mentioned, which is that uh, baby professors go through an extremely arduous, expensive training and apprenticeship period only for the chance to compete on this excruciatingly difficult labor market. And then once they get into that labor market, supposing that they are one of the 10 or 20% who successfully get a tenure stream position, that's where a majority of my attention is focused because I think that there is still a sense that if you run the gauntlet, if you make it through and you land in one of those plum positions, then everything is okay for you, at least from that day forward. And it really isn't, in part because of the heightened accelerating complexity of institutional life, but also in part because of what it took just to get there.
Yeah, I should say, I don't mean to sound dismissive with baby professors. It's just a term that pops into my head for people who are younger than me, if that makes
It's
sense.
it's not only your head.
Yeah. Um, I mean, that's where the maybe not the substantive, but the emotional basis to the critique of tenure comes in, though, is people have a vision in their head of a professor as being a very cush gig, to use a British phrase, but like almost like a sinecure, like something you don't really have to do that much and you get paid quite well for. And at very best, that is very dated and partial. But I think people sort of think, well, these people get paid to sit around and read all day, so do they really need all that job security? That's sort of, I think, the emotional basis of it, right?
Absolutely. I think that there is an image in people's head of what, like I said, it means to be a professor. I often get asked, well, but how many hours a week do you actually work? I mean, class can only take about 6 hours a week, right? And the idea that your labor is contained in the 60 to 90 minutes per class session that you're actually in front of the podium for is ludicrous. But part of the reason it sticks is, I think, because there is such reluctance within academia to push back on that understanding that is still floating out there. And if nobody if nobody says otherwise, how is somebody who is not in academia to know? It is not reasonable to expect the average reader of a national newspaper or the listener of this podcast to know that that is not what academic labor looks like if nobody bothers to explain what it looks like. And there's a great deal of reluctance to engage in that sort of translational work, particularly as it applies to tenure stream academics. But that's really the first goal I had with this book in particular and with this research more generally.
You know what it reminds me of? And this is an analogy that is only coming into my head just now, and I wouldn't push it too far. But you know where a really similar dynamic exists of there's too many people for not enough places, and you end up with both the sort of gauntlet and the impossible hours, but a public perception of you not doing very much, is political activism. For people who want to pursue politics as a vocation, there are. I used to work on political campaigns. I've worked for a variety of sort of like, yeah, lowercase L liberal organizations like Amnesty and so on, right? There are so many young kids, many of whom are very smart and capable and well educated and so on, who I want to work as a campaigner for human rights, or I want to do this or that or the other. Um, and because there's so many, and because there's just not that much money in it, it creates a ringer where a lot of people, especially like in their early 20s and so on, get absolutely rinsed down for working 80-hour weeks and like paid absolutely nothing for it. And then only a very small minority will be able to make that career.
Can I
And
ask you,
yeah, go ahead.
how does one become a political activist? I'm just talking very concretely in terms of training, investment, credentialing,
There's not one path. So a lot of the sort of heritage institutions,
meaning,
Southern Poverty Law Centre,
okay,
Amnesty, da da da,
gotcha.
they will have a workforce of 100, 200 people. And that's like for the whole of the US.
Hmm.
So, like, they will sometimes hire people out of college, and maybe this has changed a bit because all of those institutions are having a big internal hand-wringing thing about diversity and inclusion over the last 10, 15 years. Um, it used to be that they just go for someone, ooh, this person has a JD or a master's from Columbia or something. And I think that is not a great way of hiring and perhaps is changing. Increasingly now, it's just kind of a circuit with people who are already in the game. So
So
but
let me
it's
jump in and
very
say
hard to
something
get
there.
in.
Okay, so I'm going to draw a distinction and then add a similarity. The
Hmm.
distinction is that whereas you're saying there's no one way to get into political activism. It could be any number, like it could be out of college, it could be out of law school, it could be simply because you've been doing this work, not because of an
Or,
educational credential that you have, right? There are very defined requirements to even become eligible to apply or to
right.
try and break into the world of full-time academia.
Which brings me
And
to my
those
other
credentials,
one of most people won't get in that way. So what
mhm,
people do is I'll work for a political campaign, I'll do canvassing, I'll do door knocking, I'll get paid dirt to do it. And
right.
then the kind of implicit bargain there is if you stick at it for a few years, will bump you up the ladder to the next position. That's how I
Right. If you pay
my
your
head went.
dues through
Yeah,
through no wage or low wage work earlier on.
yeah, and in the activism case, usually functionally sub minimum wage, right?
Right.
Um,
So,
it's
but let me
less
just
explicit. It's not you have to do 2 years, but in practice, it actually kind of is a bit like that.
Sure. And
Anyway,
without at all, diminishing the difficulties associated with that, because I think we can see similar patterns of long, undervalued, sporadic work in many fields. Political activism, I can completely accept what you're describing there. I think um, entertainment is another one where there are
yeah,
broadly similar
if you want to be a
paths to
musician
entry.
or something.
Exactly. But here's the thing. I think that both the person who aspires to enter into those other fields like political activism or entertainment or what have you is more likely to be aware of this inevitable, expected long period of hardship and uncertainty as to your ability to break in. People talk about going to New York, waiting tables, hoping to make it big in theater or music or what have you, right? There's
Mm.
an understanding that you are going to have to do that for a long time. You're going to have to live on subsistence wages, probably doing something else, doing thankless spot work in order to make it into this field that you know is highly competitive and you stand a very low chance of actually getting into. That's different from academia. One does not go to graduate school until quite recently expecting to enter a very similar type of rat race, to be bouncing around postdocs and fellowships, earning, you know, pennies on the hour when you sit down and calculate all of the hours that most, especially junior scholars, have to work. Um, that is not part of the understanding of what it takes to train, credential, apprentice, and become eligible to play the game in academia. And the other thing that I think distinguishes this sort of um, labor market entry obstacles from the type that you're describing is that there is a very defined path
Mm.
that is largely the exclusive path. That path is a long time, uh, just in terms of what it takes to complete it. The average, I think, science and engineering doctorate takes at least 5.5 years after you have entered your doctoral program. Social sciences and non social and behavioral sciences take infinitely longer. You're looking at, I think, 8 to 10 years minimum once you factor in both the doctorate and the inescapable postdoc that comes after it. It's a long time. It is the exclusive path, and it does not come with a kind of warning sign that it is going to involve so much precarity for such a low odd of actually entering the workforce that you're trying to enter.
I think the big obvious disanalogy is what you point out, which is how clearly defined the structure is. Um, Although I will say, with activism, a lot of people come in thinking it won't be a slog, and it is a slog. Is that perhaps changing? Although obviously there's not like a defined tenure track, but there is with a lot of
There's a
institutions.
normative path,
Yeah.
and patterns. So even though, within Emory alone, within my current institution alone, the timeline for applying for tenure varies widely according to the discipline, and the
Mm.
process varies considerably. The things that are evaluated, the relative weightage, all of that can vary. There is a kind of typical pattern that exists across disciplines and across institutions with adjustments for both disciplinary and institutional norms. Um, I do think that there is more awareness sooner in the graduate training phase as to the likelihood of being able to actually enter the workforce that you're aiming yourself at. That is full-time academic employment for most graduate students. Um, I don't know whether that realization is occurring at the point of deciding whether or not to pursue academia in the first place, at the point of applying to graduate school at a greater level than it was, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. That I'm less familiar with and less confident about. But I do think that people are waking up to the reality of the academic labor market and job market in particular much sooner in their journeys, which itself is a good thing because it means that you have the opportunity to course correct with relatively lower losses to you emotionally, financially, and kind of in ability in terms of your ability to course correct.
That feels right to me. Like I was going to say, I think of the sort of more junior academics I talk to. I think they're very eyes wide open about how tough this is. Were they that eyes wide open when they embarked on the path? I'd have to ask them. I'm less sure, you know. So that feels right. So what would you say? Because it feels like tenure is one of many issues relating to higher education that's kind of got suckered into the culture war. What are the main arguments out there against it? If, as you say, it's very, very difficult to get, yes, it provides you protections once you get it, but it's still a lot of, work being a full-time professor. It's not as if you just read a few books. Um, why is this something that's gotten under some people's skin?
Okay, why is tenure something that has elicited so much critique
Yeah,
and what are some of the specific okay.
yeah.
Well, I think and this is purely a instinctive common sense reaction, but anytime the general the general um state of the universe for most people is less good than the rule or the state of being for some people, I think it is natural for that special circumstance to invite suspicion and pushback. Having job security, I think, for many of us, is better than not having job security.
Yeah,
Faculty
no
have
doubt.
immense job security compared to the average American employee. It is not unreasonable for that state of affairs to invite everything from curiosity and confusion to criticism. I think another reason why tenure has invited so much critique is, as I said, because people who hold it or people who are at least eligible to earn it because they're in a tenure track position, they're in their probationary pre-tenure phase, have done a very poor job of explaining what the realities of their labor is like. And I think that also is at least partly reasonable. The failure or the reluctance to explain the realities of tenure stream academic labor, because it seems like, you know, oh, poor privileged me. I have so much work to do, right? I'm sitting at the top of this particular workforce and I'm asking for your sympathy. I think that that is an unproductive way to think about it, although I understand why academics might feel that way. Because ultimately, if we do not explain, we cannot expect to be understood, particularly when academia is contained within such exceptional, mysterious, self contained, city state like institutions. Um, I think another reason why tenure has invited critique and pushback is because of the ways in which is because of the vocabulary that we have developed to talk about it. And by we, I partly at least mean academics ourselves. Um, we have largely spoken about tenure in connection to academic freedom, which means that essentially we're trying to answer one concern with something else that raises other concerns for many people. We have often described tenured employment as a job for life in the course of trying to defend tenure. Calling something a job for life in a context where the average employee can be fired at will is not productive. So that's a little bit on us. Um, I think that what we need to do, and what I am trying to do with this book, is give us a more accessible, recognizable, and critical vocabulary to talk about what is going on in academia in ways that show the parallels with what is going on in the general labor force, because there are a lot of those parallels to draw.
Do you
Um,
think we'll get to the positive case in 1 second, but to maybe add one more thing to the negative case? Do you think there's also just a general politicizing of this in that, for a variety of complicated reasons that we can talk about but are very real, the electorate and our politics are polarizing with respect to education? For a variety of complicated reasons that we can talk about but are very real, the political right in America is becoming increasingly hostile to higher education along any number of fronts. And they're just going to say what they can to diminish or degrade that.
I mean, on some level, there's no question that the politicization of higher education and the degree to which criticizing higher ed has become a way of articulating criticisms about American society and politics more generally, that's unarguable. But I want to slightly resist the idea that this is one of the reasons why tenure is so under attack now, because tenure is perpetually under conceptual attack as well as,
mm,
occasionally literal. As I've done research for this project over the years, you know, I'm struck by how cyclical it is. I read a compendium in an anthology that was published, I want to say in the mid 70s, as tenure comes under increased attack in the current moment because of political developments, et cetera, et cetera.
mm.
I read something mid-century, soon after tenure was kind of officially invented in the United States, saying much the same thing. So I don't think that part is new, but I want to maybe get back and say something a little bit more specific about your earlier question, which is what are the critiques?
Mm. Yeah,
Instead
please.
of just speaking to why are there
Yeah, yeah.
critiques, right? So I think part of the necessary work of translating academic labor dynamics and um, making the realities on the inside of academia visible to an audience outside the walls is taking seriously the specific arguments and concerns that are articulated about what the university does, what professors do. And so one of the things that I try to do in the book is kind of distill and consider and respond to some of the most common specific criticisms that I hear about tenure or that I've encountered about tenure. So I take three of these in particular. One is that, and they all have to do with how tenure changes behaviors or incentives for the person who holds it, right? Tenure is bad, not just because it's unfair, because why do you get something that I don't have? That's the point I was making earlier. Tenure is bad, not just because it's unusual and a little weird and I don't understand it. That's also something I was gesturing to earlier. Tenure is bad because it changes how people behave in ways that are undesirable. So, what are some of those ways? Um, One is that tenure makes you lazy once you have it. You don't work as hard. Another is that tenure makes you or encourages you to engage in more bad behavior than you would have before you had it because you think you can get away with it. And a third is that tenure encourages you and allows you to engage in what I've come to think of as like ideological renegadism, right? These are the stereotypes of the tenured professor that specifically speak to the behavioral impacts of tenure, rather than just speaking to the cushy life of academia. That's also, I don't know if that's my Canadian English or my Indian English coming in, but it's a terminology I recognize.
I've
Um,
brought in some British English, so we're dual nationaling our way through this one. Anyway, and you feel
um,
those are not fair, those are not accurate portrayals of what tenure does to people's behavior.
yes. That's the one word answer. Um, I think that in each of these cases, at a kind of, again, instinctive or maybe logical pattern analysis sort of level, I think some of these inferences about what tenure does to individual behavior are laughable. Um, for example, the idea that somebody who has gone through 12 years of schooling, gone through 4 years of college, gone through 5 to 8 at least years of doctoral training, and then a couple more years of postdoctoral precarious employment, and then gone through 5 to 7 or more years of tenure track probationary employment, and has successfully complied with expectations, jumped through all of the hoops, produced all of the right things, maintained the relationships, etc., in order to get tenure. The idea that this person is going to receive a PDF document, which is the way, most tenure letters are communicated these days. The idea that this person is going to receive a PDF document from the provost or the president or the chairperson of the board of trustees of their university saying, congratulations, you've received tenure. And that PDF document is going to encourage this person to say, now I can let loose. Now I can say all the things in the classroom that I wouldn't have said before. Now I can write that article, publish that book that has been sitting in my back pocket for the past 15 years and I've been too afraid to publish it, is laughable to me.
Hmm.
And, conceptually, it's laughable to me, but it turns out that people who are academic career coaches, consultants, when they advise people who are actually employed, they're not, I mean, many of these folks advise aspiring academics, but many of them also advise people who have academic employment, right? Those who are on the tenure track and what do I need to do to get tenure? Those who have achieved tenure. And one of the things that they say, these consultants, is that a lot of people arrive at that milestone. Okay, I have the PDF, I have tenure, and they just don't know what to do with themselves. It's not that they're ready to set off and do all kinds of ideologically contentious, offensive things because they have tenure. It's that they finally jump through all of the major hoops that they need to, and now they just feel at a loss. Um, there's more. I mean, there are some empirical reasons to think that this particular criticism, as well as the other ones about slacking off, about predatorial behavior, simply don't stand. But I think my goal is to say, one, this doesn't make sense once you incorporate a more holistic understanding of what academic labor practices and job markets are like. Two, there is not that much empirical information about whether tenure actually has these negative incentive effects or behavioral effects. Three, to the degree we have any empirical information, it generally throws cold water on those criticisms. So while I understand where these critiques are coming from, in the sense that I understand it's hard to know what's going on inside these academic environments. And it's even harder to know if nobody tells you because they're afraid to. I think that we need to talk about them and we need to show why that they're inaccurate or unfair or both.
Can I ask a side question? I do want to get to the positive case for tenure before we close. But this is something that's just been on my mind. You might not have an answer, but I'm just curious. What do you make of in some particularly humanities, particularly politics, tenure tracks? They've started building in public engagement and public impact on work as one of the measurables. And I just feel sort of curious and conflated about that as someone who then people will approach me and say, "Can I be on your podcast?" Not because, oh, it would be an interesting thing to do and I want to share my. No, it's one of the boxes I have to check. And
Did you, are
go
you
ahead.
asking this because you looked up my CV, or is this
No, 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 I'm not talking about you. I'm
okay?
talking
So
in general.
the reason I ask you that is that I am currently in a year-long internal fellowship at my institution dedicated to research impact and public scholarship. And so I've been doing essentially a mini institutional ethnography for the last year, trying to understand how my colleagues across disciplines and
Okay, so
units,
we're going to have to talk about this then. Sorry, you're going to be a bit more.
that's fine, um, about how they understand what public scholarship, public engagement means, how if they incorporate it into their own work plans, how it is understood, received, weighed, measured, valued by their colleagues and their review processes. Because you're right, this is increasingly becoming a thing in academia that, and it has always been a thing, I want to say, the
Hmm.
idea that, there are public intellectuals, that translating knowledge for a broader audience is valuable and should be something that scholars try to do. That has always been there. But I
Hmm.
think what is new is the expectation that doing that is a formal part of the academic role.
Hmm.
And you're right that increasingly this type of public engagement is being directly and indirectly incorporated into employment evaluations and decision making within academia. Um, I think I also have mixed feelings about it. I think I cut you off before you
No,
were
no,
able to
give
explain
me your mixed feelings, and then I'll maybe either echo them or add some perspective from my side as the person who's not in academia, but like
who's on the receiving end,
right.
potentially.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
give me your. I'd be very interested to compare mixed notes on our
Well,
mixed
so on
feelings on
some
this.
level, this entire research, the book, but also the research that it is a part of and that's bigger than the book, is an effort, is an exercise in public engagement and public scholarship, right? I think that I am interested in talking to non-academics in order to do a better job of explaining what academic labor is like and how the concerns that are roiling academic labor are actually much more similar to broader concerns in the labor market than is widely appreciated, right? That is an explicitly public form of scholarship that I am trying to engage in. So obviously, I kind of like it and I think it's worthwhile. And I would be supportive of people who want to do it or institutions that also see its value. But at the same time, there is a part of me that feels despondent at the idea of yet another type of work that
Yeah.
academics must do.
Yeah.
And I think that it is particularly challenging to introduce a type of work that is maybe because it's a recent entrant to the task that academics must perform, nebulous and poorly defined for the purposes of evaluation within academia. Um, Saying that you need to engage in public scholarship as part of your uh, kind of path towards tenure is well and good. But what does public scholarship mean? How do you understand whether or not
Hmm.
that candidate has engaged in enough of it? I think the definitional problems are real and they matter because they are affecting people's jobs and therefore their lives. I also think that as much as I may find the willing or voluntary engagement in this sort of work, in the way that I'm doing it, valuable and appealing, not all academics feel similarly. There are many corners of the academy where scholars, where faculty think this isn't serious, this isn't worth somebody's time. And if you're a pre-tenure faculty member, if you are an associate professor who's probably earned tenure by virtue of having that title, working towards the apex position, full professor, and you're writing a lot of op-eds or you're going on a lot of podcasts instead of publishing that extra book or the couple of articles that you could have done because time is a somewhat zero-sum resource, right? That you're doing less valuable work. There are a lot of people who think that. And because those people are often sitting in judgment of you, it is even more problematic, I think, to say, and you must do this work.
I think so. I would be much more, I don't know how these things look on the university side. I would be much more comfortable with public engagement being like, here are 5 things that you can do that will make your case stronger. Pick 2. You know what I mean? Like it's something you can do to bonus it, but there's maybe other things you could do to
That's
bonus it.
generally how it exists right now in many institutions, that
I've
it's
heard for some
nice.
people, apparently it is now you have to.
That is also true.
I'm
I
much less
recently,
comfortable with the like you have to approach, I
I
think.
can understand that. I also think it's worth noting that there are the formal direct requirements for
Mm.
public scholarship, and there are concerns to be raised, like you're mentioning about those. But then there are also very powerful informal pressures to engage in this work that in the vast majority of institutions in the United States still counts formally for nothing. And the reason I say that there are informal or indirect requirements, there's a kind of budding scholarship on public scholarship. And there's some reason, as this literature suggests, to think that, say, students think more highly of faculty who are talking heads, who are op-ed writers, who are publicly
Have
engaged
10,000
scholars.
followers on Blue Sky.
Exactly, and then that affects their reviews of the professor, which in turn feeds into a formal requirement that exists at virtually every institution, regardless of whether or not they have formally incorporated public scholarship into their evaluation processes, which is your teaching, right?
Yeah.
Another thing that I'll mention, uh, a colleague told me that even if it doesn't formally factor into your evaluations as a pre-tenure scholar, um, the sort of public activity, public engagement that we're talking about can be deeply impactful for your ability to get tenure or not, because it might, if your name is recognizable, it might encourage a big name faculty member at another institution to write one of your tenure letters, your reference letters in support of your tenure. And the influential reference letter writer is going to significantly advance your chances of getting tenure at your institution. It's very backdoor, but nonetheless, it matters.
And it can only be good for citations, right? If that's another metric people are being judged by, in that, like, if I were to write an academic thing, which I do once in a blue moon, and I think, oh, I want a citation for X claim, it's just probably more likely to pop into my head someone who's regularly on my Blue Sky feed. Oh, they talk about that. Let me grab their paper, you know?
I think that's That's
Maybe,
that's likely true. I mean, that seems very reasonable to me, but I think that already existed within academic forms of
Yeah.
production anyway. So there's it's well established that um, th there are patterns of intra-group citation uh, that have nothing to do with your public persona, but simply if you are somebody who has written influential things, are in a position of influence at an influential institution, whatever, on this topic, I will continue to cite you over and over again instead of citing maybe somebody who has written more recently, more narrowly tailored to my topic, and so on. And many of those people who get cited ad nauseum have traditionally been white men.
Yeah.
Um,
Let me echo one concern and add another. Because on the one
mm,
hand, I don't mean to say I'm at all critical of scholars doing public engagement. Like it's great, obvious, especially in like politics. Obviously, you
mhm.
could be trying to share your ideas, right? And obviously, there's a lot of good that. I'm not saying let's not do it. I'm saying I think more thought perhaps needs to be given to how to do it better. Um, I think the one concern is time. That you mentioned, that's a huge one. I've given a few talks now at universities. People say, "Will you give us a talk for like how to get on podcasts, get a following on Blue Sky, these sorts of because these are things they have to do now."
Mhm.
And I go and I tell them as best I can. Here's how you get to 5K followers. Here's how you get your work out there. But I have to preface everything with this is time consuming.
Yeah.
This is like, it's not like you go on one podcast and you're a household name, even a big one, right? Like, this is grinding. This is you keep doing it. You
Mhm.
keep posting, you write some public facing pieces, you write some more, you promote your own stuff online. And all of that, I'm not saying that's bad, right? But that is one
But
use
it
of
is
your
labor
time that can
intensive.
then is hugely labor intensive, right? And like I can do it because this is my main thing. I don't teach. I don't, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
But like that time decision is going to be, and of course people have families and stuff as well. But it's just I don't think necessarily. I think people can just say, "Oh, do some public engagement,"
Right.
realizing what it looks like for most people most of the time
Absolutely.
to build
I
a
think that
public
is
profile.
this is a different version of the idealized image of the professor's life that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
This is an idealized image of the public intellectual's life
Mm.
that you just sit down one day, you jot down a few thoughts, you send it off to the New York Times, and it appears the night, later
Yeah,
that
yeah,
week
yeah.
or something. And I think I agree with you. I have, notwithstanding my interest in my own research, in speaking to a broader audience, experimenting with different forms of engagement, not just journal articles and books published by academic presses and so on. Notwithstanding my own interest in doing that, I have real concerns about formalizing and incorporating that into evaluation processes. I do think that it needs to be considered, and we need to try to come up with that kind of formalization such that this doesn't become an amorphous, contentious, informal, and yet inescapable added requirement on academics, because I think that's where we're headed. I would rather spend the time and the effort to think about what it can mean in a very nuts and bolts sort of way to incorporate public engagement into evaluation processes, set some parameters and create some language for it rather than say it's a nice thumb on the scale. Yeah, you should do it if you have time, because most of us don't have time. We barely have the
Yeah,
time
and
we need
I
to do the
would
things we're
want to
formally
see
evaluated on.
people who do devote that time and do it well. I think that's not unreasonable to say if you're going to invest all that, there should be some recognition. Let me
Right.
add another one though that I think is really ill considered, which is diversity concerns, because I don't think this gets factored in at all. I can tell you from my perspective, as someone who has not a like a medium public platform, if I ever do anything where I'm asking for volunteers, people to invite themselves on the podcast, people to give me their views, whatever, that is going to skew younger, it's going to skew male, it's going to skew white, overwhelmingly so, right?
Okay.
I would say of the people who self-invite on the podcast, 8 out of 10 are men.
Huh.
Um, and I don't think, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I don't think women are simply naturally more timid or much less good or anything like that. I think people are perhaps subconsciously but rationally responding to incentives. I think we are much more critical of women who speak their mind forcefully than men. And I think there's a good deal of evidence to say that people who have a public following, we all get some harassment or people being mean about us. I think the data's pretty in now that women get more. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, at some level, and this might not be a conscious decision people make, but at the margin, I think it's entirely, you would expect, given that environment, men to be more confident to put themselves forward because there's less risks to doing so. You would just expect
Okay.
that.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. But then we've institutionalized that.
Mm, I see what
We've
you're saying.
we've
Yeah.
said you get points on your job
Yeah.
application for putting yourself forward.
Yeah.
And I think the other side of
We're
that
institutionalizing discrepancies. Yeah.
that aren't arising, I don't think. I mean, maybe women are socialized to be more cautious, maybe. But I think at some level, women just are rationally more cautious about having a high public profile and putting their views forward because women get more harassment in public. I don't
I
think that's,
I am obviously not going to argue with you on that point. I'm just going to add another possible explanation for the imbalance in
yeah.
self-selection, which is in the average heterosexual household, women are doing a hell of a lot more work in the domestic context as well.
I think
So
that could,
it's,
I think it's almost certainly multi-causal. There's a bunch of
yeah,
stuff that feeds into
exactly.
that.
But so if we're
But given
talking
that
about
that's
this
the
as something that
reality,
takes, yeah,
what do you do with that?
right. Yeah,
You
no,
know?
I
And there's
agree. That
there's the
is
problem is there's zero accountability on my side. I can have whoever I want on the podcast. You
right.
know
I
what I
mean, because
mean?
we're not, I mean, we can't impose an obligation on you to, you can impose on obligations on
I
yourself to
do,
have a certain range of podcast guests and whatnot. But
and
like,
I do at
it is
least
not,
all I've got so far, and this is not, I think, a permanent and enduring solution, is I try to make guest decisions with these sorts of concerns at least somewhat in mind.
mhm,
That's all I've got. And I don't think that's a brilliant structural fix for the
mm,
entire thing. Because I can, yeah, I mean, you will literally see that in my podcast history. I'll be like, we've had 5 guys on in a row. Like, I'll literally
mm,
just think like that.
hmm.
And then sort of almost make like soft course corrections. But like,
There are all kinds of factors we could consider, and I'm really glad that you raised this because now it is something that uh, I can incorporate into my own thinking on when I'm talking about public scholarship and thinking about how and whether to formalize it for the purposes of incorporating it into evaluation processes.
I
But
don't have a solution. I'm
no, no,
merely
no, I know.
a
I mean,
set of
well, now you're being the
concerns.
academic. You're throwing out
Yeah.
the problem without giving us a solution, right? But I think you're absolutely right. We can look at all kinds of factors. So, for instance, the tendency of women to cluster in certain disciplines,
Yeah.
or sub concentration, subfields within disciplines. And I'm sure that if we kind of took that at least within certain clusters, like humanities clusters, social sciences, and whatnot, it would be easy to make some not entirely ridiculous argument about the relative opportunities for public engagement in clusters that women tend to gravitate towards versus what men tend to gravitate towards. I don't know. There's lots of possible contributing factors, but your underlying point that there are imbalances in this already nebulous, already suspect from within the academy area of activity, public engagement. And we need to be cautious about not replicating and concretizing those imbalances when we make public engagement a formal part of the labor evaluations of professors. Point well taken.
But like, I do want to end with like, because I did sidetrack us with that, but I think isn't interesting and worth thinking aloud about thing. Like if we're going to make that a formal thing, like let's
Mm,
at least think about this stuff. And also, while I'm on it, how most podcasters are young men, what most people with access to media things are young men, what protections are there if we're going to be insisting that academics go out into this, that you're not experiencing discrimination from us?
yeah.
Because I think at the most people who have access to like a prominent blog,
Oh,
news
man.
site, or whatever, look like me, right? And I'm not like some self-hating, oh my God, I feel so bad to be white or whatever. I don't go in for any of that. But what protections are there for you that we don't discriminate against you? Because at the moment the answer appears to be none whatsoever, right?
Yeah,
It's at least
absolutely.
asking the question, right?
Right.
You know?
And I think even if the answer is not only there are no protections, it is also there are no protections and yet you need to do this thing. It still pays to be aware of the answer that there are
Yeah,
no protections and we are requiring you to do this thing despite the fact that there are no protections. I mean, like, I think
yeah.
even that level of acknowledgement is valuable. It's certainly not enough, but it's better than going blindly into this, which I think a lot of institutions now are reasonably and genuinely interested in becoming better integrated with the society that they consider themselves to be a part of, whether that's their immediate communities or, broader communities of discourse or whatever. I mean, I think a lot of institutions are stepping hesitantly into this public scholarship kind of zone. And at the very least, I think it would be productive. It is ethically necessary for them to step in with the understanding that not only is this a new area of activity, a poorly defined and internally suspect area of activity, but one that has its own kind of discrepancies, injustices, imbalances that the university has no ability to correct for, even if it's interested in correcting for them, and it's going to bring those in. I used to study gig work.
Mm,
Um, and one of the major topics of conversation kind of in the late 2010s was the idea that the algorithms are incorporating and exacerbating prejudices
mm,
by taking in consumer feedback and then formalizing it,
mm,
using it to create rankings for service providers, using those rankings to categorize as like high value producers. And then you get additional goodies if you're classified that way, right? You get pushed to a consumer's screen higher. You get to charge more in terms of rates and stuff like that. So there was a lot of conversation about how the algorithm is not neutral. It is
mm.
incorporating everything that exists in the people who are providing the algorithm with information. And then it's institutionalizing that, it's distilling that, and it's kind of exacerbating that when it uses that information to create structures of evaluation and hand out benefits or privileges, right? And I think what you're very helpfully pointing out here is that we're in a similar moment with respect to public scholarship as a potential formal role for the institutionally located scholar.
Yeah. All of which I should hasten to add does not in any way mean that, for all that I've just said,
Yes, I
public
agree.
scholarship is a great thing. I love that I have my podcasts and I want to listen to half an hour
This
on,
is starting to
say,
sound like that Seinfeld episode.
but
Not that
no,
there's
no.
anything wrong with that.
I've never watched Seinfeld. Jill
Okay,
national that I am.
sorry.
No, 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 yeah. But yeah, public scholarship, good. Just as someone who's been very much in the weeds of it, I don't, I don't think. thought through a lot. I think they've just been added as another box on the form sometimes.
Yes,
Um,
agreed.
anyway, anyway, back at the ranch, we were talking about tenure. Um,
Yes, long ago.
long ago. Um, so okay, tenure is very hard to get. It is not a slacker's position. Um, the behavioral changes that people imagine it might have are prima facie implausible and empirically seem not to be the case. Cool, 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 cool. Still, what's the affirmative case? Why have tenure?
Um, yeah, this is the $1 million question, right? Or the significantly less than $1 million question.
The whatever it
Um,
is, full Professor Zern question.
um, so the standard explanation of why we need tenure is all wrapped up in academic freedom. And I want to do a little bit of what you were just doing with respect to public scholarship and start and repetitively say how I am very pro academic freedom. I think it's very important. I enjoy thinking that I have it to whatever degree I actually have it. I agree that tenure is an important element in how we provide scholars with intellectual and pedagogical autonomy that in turn we have reasons to value. So tenure helps create and facilitate academic freedom. That is one reason. That is the classic reason. It is a reason that I accept, I agree with, and I can unreservedly get behind. But I think that there are other reasons. They have more to do with labor practices. I think they also matter. I don't think that they should inspire kind of embarrassment or cynicism in the way that I think they often do in academics. And so they're the ones that I focus on, not because I don't think academic freedom is important or I don't think tenure has any role to play in ensuring academic freedom for professors, particularly in the United States. It's just that I'm trying to focus on the things that do not get enough airtime, in my opinion. Um, I think a big affirmative reason why we need to have tenure is that it provides some kind of incentive to pursue this line of work that we still, despite the attacks on higher ed, want at least some people, good people, talented people, committed people to pursue, right? I mean, again, I'm just going to go back through what it takes to get to the point where you get that lovely PDF that says that you have tenure now. 12 years of primary education, 4 years of college, 5, 6, 10 years of doctoral education, probably 1 to 4 years of postdoctoral service work, 5 to 7-ish years on the tenure track. And during all of this time, you are either earning no money because you're, for the most part, not allowed to have off campus jobs when you're in a doctoral program. You're earning very little money, either for the on campus jobs that you are allowed to hold, like being somebody's research assistant, being somebody's teaching assistant, working in a low ranking clerical position in some academic office, or being a postdoctoral fellow. You are not saving for all of the things that one is supposed to save for, particularly in the United States where there is no meaningful social safety net. You're not saving for retirement. You're not saving for a house. You're not saving for your child's college tuition, assuming that you ever feel sufficiently personally and financially stable to have a child. You're not saving all of those things. And while you might be able to put money in the bank and pay for your needs and wants if you eventually get a tenure track position and then you get tenure, you will never make up for that lost time. You will never earn back that money that you didn't save and the interest and the things that it would have allowed you to do. So we're doing all of this. We're giving up time, money, and frankly, we're giving up a lot. And I've slipped into the first person, because obviously this is applicable to me and deeply personal to me. But we're giving up not only that immense amount of time, that immense amount of money and financial security that cannot be wholly repaired. We're also giving up, in many cases, just the ordinary things that one does in that stage of life. We're reducing the ease of finding a romantic partner, living in the same house with them, potentially having children, because you cannot easily do those things when your life is so precarious and resource constrained. So you do all of this. You get into that job. It is a hard job. It doesn't pay that well. In many disciplines, you will be earning less as a PhD holding tenure stream professor than you could have earned certainly as a PhD holding industry working professional, sometimes less than you could have earned with a lower credential, like a master's in industry. So you're earning less after giving up so much more. Job security is one of the few things you get at the end of the road that makes all of this not entirely ludicrous as a life choice. That's one big reason. I think it is a form of compensation in kind for what it requires to become a tenured professor today. Always, but especially today. I think another reason that tenure matters, that we need tenure, is that the multiplicity of tasks that most faculty in most institutions today, in the United States in particular, are required to perform, and the difficulty of those tasks, as well as the time scale over which those tasks can be performed, requires a great deal of job security. So let me kind of think of each of those in turn. I said that there are just a lot of things that professors have to do. Yes, you teach, but that also means that you develop course syllabi, you prepare for class, you teach the class, you grade the assignments or the examinations, you advise students in office hours about questions related to class, you participate in curriculum committee regarding the class requirements. That one thing has so many different components. You are conducting research, which means you're applying for grants or administering grants or conducting fieldwork or lab experiments or archival research. You're traveling. You're reading an immense amount of literature. You're analyzing that, you're synthesizing it, you're writing it, you're editing it, you're revising it, you're sending it out for peer review, you're getting comments back, and you're doing that again. You are conducting peer review, you're reading other people's work, you're providing commentary on that, which does nothing for you except that it is something that you benefit from and keeps the system going. You conduct administrative service. You have to sit on the committees. You have to write the white papers. I just got a 35-page white paper about what possible generative AI policies my school might consider adopting. Not only do I have to read and think about that 35-page white paper before the faculty meeting on Monday, but 4 of my colleagues had to write it. They had to agree on what goes into it. They had to refine that and then send it out to me so that I would have this 35-page white paper to read, by Monday. So there is so much just in the teaching, research, and service trifecta that is the traditional academic role. But there is also now guiding, mentoring, supporting students in all kinds of amorphous ways outside of classroom hours or office hours, even. I am fielding texts and emails from students asking life advice questions, career advice questions. None of that goes into my formal evaluation, but it's part of the work. It will be reflected in my course reviews. And so it is part of my job. There are a lot of things that academics do, and it is not possible to do all of them within a 24-hour day. And so what you need to do is often perform those tasks sequentially. So this week, I'm having a lot of these kinds of conversations, podcast, interview, so on. Why? Because it is part of supporting, promoting, and spreading my research work. That means I'm not working on the next book I have due to my publisher in January. I will work on that the following week. And the week after that, I will be reading a lot of my students' essays in order to give them comments so that they can revise and submit for their journals. You need to be able to perform things sequentially when there are so many of them to perform. You cannot perform necessary tasks sequentially if you do not have job security over the entirety of that period. Otherwise, you would always be failing at your job. You would be not performing some part of your job. When there are so many parts of your job that they cannot all be done in the time that you have, and you need to perform them not simultaneously, but sequentially, job security becomes an essential component to making that work happen somehow, in some way. I also said, sorry, this is expanding much more than I thought it would. I also said that the tasks themselves, in addition to being numerous, are difficult, right? Some of that got baked into what I've just said, that teaching is much more than just showing up in a classroom, standing behind a podium and spouting stuff for 2 hours. I mean, a lot of people in many disciplines don't even go to a classroom. Many lab sciences faculty do most of their teaching in a lab, right? So that stereotypical image is only partially relevant anyway. But it's not just that. It is also now, say, with the push to better accommodating a more diverse range of students who come to our institutions with a wide range of backgrounds, experiences, social capital, just raw informational resources because of where they went to school before they came to us. It is accommodating a wide range of needs, which means developing new and multiple types of evaluations, providing flexible deadlines, which means you can't know that on the 15th you will receive all of your essays, you will grade them, and then you will be done and you can move on to the next thing that you need to do, writing that book. On the 20th, it means some essays will come in on the 15th, some might come in on the 20th, some might come in at the end of term, and you need to respond and react accordingly in a timely way, right? Which means that you cannot check things off your list, sequence your activities in the way that you need to in order to get all of them done. Just doing teaching well in the way that I think most faculty want to do, and which in part requires responding to the student population we have and the wide range of needs, interests, aptitudes, backgrounds that we're encountering, responding to that makes the work of teaching more difficult now than it would have been, say, 50 years ago, when maybe we weren't as concerned about being responsive to a diverse array of learning styles or needs or backgrounds, right? So it is more difficult now. And I think that having the ability to adjust for the additional challenge of the work is something that is really only facilitated when you're not worried about whether or not you're going to have the job in the first place in order to do the work. The last component of why I think you need the kind of immense, unusual job security that tenure offers in order to do the work of academia now is that much of the research work in particular, but not only, this also applies to teaching, much of the research work that is the single greatest component of your evaluation package when it comes to things like tenure or promotion. That work has an extremely long durée in terms of how it unfolds, right? If you are doing lab-based experiments, those take months or years before they generate any insight that is worth developing into formal written research products.
Even write a book in political philosophy, I would say to do
Takes
academic
a long
papers,
time.
get them shopped around,
Yes.
get peer review, get feedback, get response, process, evaluate, put together a book, publish a book. You're talking 3 years minimum.
I completely agree with you, but I am always trying to choose examples
That are
that,
like, I'm just saying, even in a
yes,
comparatively faster
right,
process and a
exactly.
comparatively, we're not doing empirical experiment, or not usually. It's
It doesn't
still,
have to be
it's not something,
empirical. Yeah,
it's not something that would realistically happen over a 1 or 2 year contract.
right. Absolutely. I mean, if I take one of my disciplines, anthropology, I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, which means, I professionally hang out with people.
Mm.
And to do that, it takes money, not a whole lot, but you need grants in order to conduct field work for the most part. You have to pay for the airfare, for the living expenses, whatnot, right? So then you have to think of a project, you have to apply for a grant, and give yourself enough time that if you don't get it this grant or on this cycle or something, you can apply again. So you need to allot about a year, maybe a year and a half to get a grant that will allow you to do the field work. Field work is very slow. It's not expensive. It's not um, uh, like necessarily a team-based thing. So its labor costs are low as well, but it takes time. It is slow by design, right? There was generally an expectation when I was in my doctoral program that your dissertation fieldwork would be 12 to 18 months. And I think that's relatively standard in sociocultural anthropology writ large. So that means that for 12 to 18 months, you're out there doing research. So we've added a year to a year and a half onto the year to year and a half that you spent kind of getting the grant. That's 2 to 3 years. Then you get back and you have to start parsing through your notes, synthesizing the information, actually doing the writing. Let's say that you do all of that in a year and you want to write a book. As you said, even in fields that do not require empirical work or do not require travel, like, I mean, history, you might have to go to the archive, right? It's not empirical in that sense, but it still requires time and travel. But even in fields that don't require that, it takes, 1 to 3 years to just get a book out. So the timeline over which academic work is done is long. And I mean, I suppose we could have 20-year contracts and they wouldn't be indefinite in the way that tenure is, but they would provide employment security. I'm not particularly sure what the merits of that approach are as opposed to the one that we currently have, but it would need to be something like that to meaningfully allow this work that is the most important element of the job to get done.
Can I maybe add a really dumb reason to those informed reasons? People like having tenure. I don't think that's like a wild argument to make. And I think
But
with
I'm trying to convince other people, right?
yeah,
I'm
to
not
support
trying
it.
to,
I
yeah.
think to maybe build slightly on that dumb foundation, I think with all sorts of social goods, there can be an instinct to say, why does that person get it and I don't? Instead of flipping the question and saying, should more people have it?
Right. So I began with the first half of that, right? That I
Mm.
understand why tenure inspires confusion, criticism, suspicion. It's unusual.
Yeah,
And its contrast is particularly stark in the United States,
yeah.
right? Um, And I think another reason why there is not more talk by academics about tenure as a labor concern, as a labor protection, and about the dynamics of tenure stream labor
Mm,
performance is because there's often a suspicion that when you do that, you're trying to argue for the system as it is and as it is practiced. Because after all, you're arguing for something that already exists, right?
mm,
But I'm not saying that tenure is perfect as it is practiced by any individual institution or the current state of academic employment in terms of that 70-30-ish split that we talked about earlier is perfect. No, I think that there is a very solid, necessary argument to be made for more faculty to have tenure as we currently know it implemented in ways that are better. And I think that there's also an argument to be made for different types of tenure that do not actually that do currently exist at some institutions, but is not widely practiced. That would also provide a great deal of job security, which I view as so important to defend, to explaining why tenure matters and why we need to
mm.
have it. Um, so I understand the hesitation that like people don't want to say tenure is good because it provides job security and job security is good because there's immediately a sense that you're saying the way tenure is now is good enough. And that doesn't necessarily follow,
I
right?
understand why that would be a concern. I merely explain how it works in my own head, and perhaps perhaps I'm not representative, and what's convincing for me wouldn't be convincing for other people. But I generally think job security is good. Now, there are exceptions, and there's certain types of blah, 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 right? But I generally think job security is good. One, people generally prefer it. As you said, people are willing to accept tenure as quite a significant compensation for a whole bundle. It's not the only reason people become professors, but it clearly, if you ask in the revealed preference of their rankings, it's clearly quite high, right? So if people want something, I don't think that's an argument for it in itself, right? And certainly if an institution chooses to provide it. But I think there's a broader set of arguments about job security. I think this is a much longer point, so I'll condense it. I think historically, political theory and political philosophy have been very geared towards questions of inequality of wealth and income, which are, of course, very important. I think modern political theory and political philosophy is also much more incorporating in, or perhaps returning back to, questions of inequality of power, of status, of freedom, and of security. And I think it matters for the sort of society we want to live in, even if have a stable job day to day. If there's someone who at any moment can say it's a Tuesday and I'm in a bad mood and you're fired, I think, to use the philosophical term, someone like Elizabeth Pettit would call that freedom as non-domination, right? I think that's an important good. I perhaps wouldn't go as far as Philip in saying that's the only good we need to care about. Nonetheless, I think that's real and that's important, right? Or questions of democracy and governance, as Elizabeth Anderson would bring in, talking about like workplace democracy and thinking about how power is structured. So I think, yeah, in general, and again with some exceptions and qualifiers, people like having job security, and I think it's good for all sorts of normative stroke democratic reasons. That if you're going to exercise the power of firing somebody, which can hugely disrupt their lives, cause real suffering, that there should be built in systems of accountability to using that power. Now, why do I say all that? I say all that because it seems like most people don't. Like you say, the norm in America is employment at will. And then there are these odd little pockets of job security, of which tenure is not the only one, but a very significant one. Okay, well, that's the state of affairs. It seems to me we're not doing anything great by saying, well, why do you get it and I don't? And let's tear that one remaining pocket away. I agree there is an intuitive weirdness, to use a technical phrase, an intuitive weirdness to they get it and I don't. But I think the answer is there needs to be more job security in other areas. I just go the other
I
way with
mean, why not level up instead of leveling down,
yeah,
right?
there you go.
No,
You just condensed 5 minutes of me wanting to a
sorry.
phrase.
But no, I hear you. I agree with you. But I think this is not unlike, what was
You think
that,
that won't
20?
be compelling as a public argument? Level up, not level down?
No, I don't. Not in the
Okay.
United States. There was, wasn't there during the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton made a comment to the effect of, "We're not Denmark."
Yeah.
And I always think of that in
But and yet,
circumstances like this.
we
I'm
as
not saying that
Americans,
aspirational, uh, ideas and platforms are not worth pursuing, right? But I think that, and this is actually coming out of my work on gig workers,
yeah.
where I thought a lot about individual autonomy at work,
Mm,
and freedom as non-domination, versus non-interference, the kind of more classically liberal conceptions of negative freedom and stuff. But I I think that I want to engage in a conversation that has a chance of getting traction in the United States, not necessarily the version of it that exists at this particular historical moment, but one that, in this respect, in terms of the way that job security, autonomy at work, the relationship between work and social safety nets has been thought of, changed over decades, shows us is just some things are unlikely to change. And given those things, I would like to make the best argument I can for what is going to remain an exceptional form of work relationship.
mm. I hear that. I don't know. I find as a very, very minor public communicator of political ideas, people respond well to freedom as non-domination. That's one you can directly port out of political theory and give to people, and they say, yeah, I like that. That rings true to me. I don't like being under my boss's thumb. Now, when I say people, I am talking broadly the left side of the political spectrum there. I am, but I'm talking the whole left. You know, the sort of Hillary Clinton voters through to your Bernie Sanders ones, through to your communists or whatever. I find people respond reasonably well to freedom as non-domination. I find people respond reasonably well to greater workplace security, democracy in the workplace. I think it would all poll reasonably well. Now, is any of that going to actually be translated into policy? Yeah, no, I agree, no time soon, right? But that's more because of various institutional design type questions than it is necessarily what you could activate people with. I don't know. I mean, ultimately, this is a descriptive claim about the world, and I could very well be wrong, but preaching a sort of leveling up of economic, not just equality, but economic freedom, I think, especially post 2008, doesn't feel that wild to me. I agree. Now, that may be in a sort of quiet tension with the sort of defend what pockets of it we do have. I don't know. I'd have to think about that more. I don't know. It doesn't seem that, from my perspective, it doesn't seem that wild to me. Although, if your point is, yeah, but you're not going to pass those laws anytime soon, then yeah, obviously not.
Right, but I'm primarily not, although increasingly, given events of the last 3 weeks and then events of the last 9 months,
Hmm.
this is untrue. But I'm primarily not talking about things that are legal,
Hmm.
aside from the contract at the core of what I'm
Mm.
discussing, right? And the extent to which tenure is a contractual and therefore legally defined relationship. Um, so it's not that I don't want to make that flip the narrative and say we should be leveling up instead of trying to level down by getting rid of this one last pocket of employment security. It's not that I don't want to make that argument because I think it's not going to translate into laws or into policy, because there's no real laws or policy to talk about in
Mm.
this sense. We're talking about industry norms and
Right.
labor practices, right? It is simply that I think, given that I'm talking about industry norms and practices, and I'm talking about an industry that I think is unusually, there are a lot of things about academia that I think have been exceptionalized
Mm.
in ways that are inaccurate. But I think the relative insularity of academia as an industry has not been exaggerated too grossly.
Mm.
And when we're talking about that kind of industry, and we're primarily talking about norms and practices within that industry, then I think the first goal has to be translation, acknowledgement of differences, identification of similarities, rather than the broader kind of sky view argument about whether or not we should be leveling up across industries writ
Mm.
large. You need to finish point one before you can get to point 10.
Yeah, or at the very least, there's a separate set of reasons or concerns. We can say there is a broad big picture on all other things being equal. People do tend to like job security. That applies to everyone. Then within a university, there are a number of much more specific reasons. It's one plus, you could say. Well,
Mhm.
that would be. I'm just thinking about whether I agree with this and what's going on in my own head. What's going on in my own head is there sort of is blanket reason across the board, people like job security. And then within the context of a university, there are additional reasons that you ran through of why, additional to that in this specific case,
Right.
this is in service of a number of things we might care about.
I agree. I think we're saying similar things. My only kind of qualification is that um, if somebody who is less amenable to my specific arguments than you seem to be were to say, well, but why do academics alone need this heightened form of job security? Why don't I get it? Why shouldn't I get it?
Hmm.
And I say, I think you should have it. Um, that requires me to, I think that is the kind of uh, zooming out that many academics rightly enjoy doing and do much better than I do. And as a result, we have not made the more narrowly circumscribed arguments that would be helpful to translating what is going on in here to the folks looking confusedly out there.
Almost seems to me like, in terms of what's penetrated, we've done neither. Like, why don't I get it? Well, there's not a prominent, even someone like Bernie Sanders, I don't think has talked about economic democracy very much, maybe as a phrase. But to say, yeah, you should have it too. I don't, I think you're very cautious of that answer, and I hear why. I don't think that's a bad answer. Yeah, you should too. Now, in addition to that, there are some specific university reasons why, in this case, this is a good thing. I don't know. I feel like you could go either way with that. And as in terms of how it's understood, we've gone neither. Now it's just like, why do they get this special thing and they don't even need it? And stroke, they're a bunch of
Yeah.
lefty social justice radicals who need to be taken down a peg anyway. And now we're going to ban vaccines. Where did that come from? Well, go fuck yourself. Like, that's the conversation we've ended up in.
Yes, I agree. And maybe it's too late to have this narrowly circumscribed conversation that I'm trying to have.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's a fair argument to be made that it is. But I think we are also at a moment where thinking hard about the role of teaching and learning and producing new knowledge, uh, about the whether and how much we value that, what its institutionalized form should be, and what the relationship between that institution and its broader surroundings should be, where that is up for some serious reconsideration. And so, to the extent that I'm right about this, like that we're in this moment of reevaluating whether to do these things, how to do them, through what vehicle to do them. I think it matters to talk about the specific dynamics, norms, and practices that currently obtain, so that we can think about what might come next.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's pause there. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated that.
Thank you for having me.